Joe Amaral is well known to many of you. Some of you watch his program, First Century Foundations on CTS. Some of you have read his book, Understanding Jesus. And he has come our way because he has not only great insights for us, but for the next couple of weeks we're going to be offering you a really special thing called God's Holy Days, a DVD offer, which you'll hear more about a little later in the program. But Joe, you come with a great track record of insights into the Hebraic roots of our faith. And I think we should just start out by kind of getting a little background here. Why did you even get interested in this in the first place?
Well, the truth is I initially wasn't interested in this. Like a lot of Christians, I grew up in the church knowing that Israel at some point in history had played an important role, but definitely God was finished with them. The church had come in and replaced them, and all the blessings and promises in the Bible was for us. And so I never really had any heart for Israel at all. And I pastored for 10 years, didn't give any attention to Israel. It wasn't until after I finished pastoring at the end of 2001 that I was at a gathering where somebody was talking to me about Israel. And they said, you know, don't you want to go to Israel? And at that time, I don't know if you remember, back 2001, 2002, that was the height of the Intifada, the Arab uprising. There were suicide bombings all the time. And I said, no way, I don't want to go to Israel. Who would want to go there, you know? And through a turn of events, this dear person sponsored a trip for me to go to Israel. And I went as a tourist. And when I got to Israel, I was just so taken by the culture. And it sounds so silly now. Here we are in 2011. I didn't realize how Jewish Israel was.
Right.
You know, I didn't realize how Jewish Jesus was. And how much that culture made him the man that he was. The way he spoke, the way he thought, the way he rationalized, you know, and also the political situation of Rome in and around him. And so initially there was no desire, but once I went to Israel and I began to see how much the culture affected the man, Jesus, I said, how can I know him if I don't know his people, if I don't know his culture? You know, people who understand the Portuguese background, they understand me better. Oh, that's why you're so loud. That's why you're always talking with your hands. And I came back with a real passion to learn more about not just Jewish culture, but first century Jewish culture, which is the one that he was born into. And revelation after revelation. I mean, you've lived in Israel, Jim. You know how much that culture is different from ours. And so I began to study like there was no tomorrow. You know, I dropped out of high school. I'd never read a book in my life up until this point, and I couldn't stop reading. I mean, I knew Jesus, but I didn't know Yeshua. You know, this Hebrew prophet, this Hebrew Messiah. And once I began to learn, it became really apparent that God wasn't calling me to learn it just for me, but he was calling me to share it with the body.
Now, when you were training for the ministry, you went to a Bible college, a theological seminary type organization. How much did you learn about Israel there?
Nothing. No. I remember one class we were forced to learn, you know, the dynasty of Israel, all the kings, all their names, how long they ruled and reigned. But outside of that, not a whole lot. And what I did here was what I know now is called replacement theology. Whether or not it was the policy of the institution, it was definitely the vibe that was in and around the place, that because the Jews rejected Jesus, God rejected them. Right. And so every time we read in the New Testament the word Israel, it really should be church. Right. And that theology worked for a long time until 1948, when Israel became a nation again. I was like, oh, hang on a second, these promises are for the physical nation of Israel. So although I didn't learn a lot about Israel in school, I mean, being in the land, I've heard it called the fifth gospel, you know, and it really brought the scriptures alive for me.
Now, when you talk about it, bringing the scriptures alive, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Because having lived there for 7 years, I mean, the Bible for me is in 3D, you know, it's kaleidoscopic. Because you taste the taste, you smell the smells, you feel the dirt on your hands and the bleaching of your hair, and you know, I mean, it's just such an all-encompassing kind of experience. But when you went there for the first time, what was it that initially struck you before anything else?
The name Yeshua.
Which means?
Salvation.
Yeah.
I'd never heard it before. And God bless my tour guide. His name is Aryeh Bar David, the lion from the tribe of Judah. And I'm like, hi, I'm Joe. Nice to meet you. And Aryeh, he kept saying, oh, Yeshua said this. Oh, and Yeshua did that. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but at the time I kept thinking, the poor guy is saying his name wrong. Somebody should tell him, And so I said, listen, why do you call him Yeshua? And he looked at me and he said, where are you from? And I think he meant, like, are you from the moon? Like, what do you mean? Why do I call him that? That's his name. And he began to tell me the whole, the Hebrew, meaning behind his name. And that was the first eye-opener for me. And then, of course, seeing the land. Going through the desert on the way to Jericho and seeing all the hills and learning about the parable, of the Good Samaritan, and seeing the lay of the land and going, oh, okay, I can see now why Matthew wrote that and why that's like that. So definitely being in the land changed the way I saw the scripture.
While you were there, was it at that time or later that the historical significance and biblical significance of the feasts emerged for you?
That came later. Initially, what hit me was the power of culture.
Right.
I had been to Jamaica and Trinidad. I'd preached in other parts of the world. But here I was, not just in a different culture, but in the culture of the Bible. And so learning that, there were figures of speech. There were certain expectations within that language, that Semitic language. That was really the initial driving point for me, was learning the culture and what things meant in their time. And then it was a natural progression, moving just from cultural idioms and from cultural practices. The feasts were inevitable. Because you're reading in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it would say, during the Jewish feast of Passover, on the last day of Tabernacles. And you hear about all these feasts, and you say, well, what are the feasts? I'm not Jewish. Do I need to know about them? And that put me on a whole other journey of discovery as well.
I, like you, I'd studied historically in preparation for the ministry about Israel and the history of Israel and so on. But until we, in our case, moved there and lived there, we didn't realize how important the feasts were. Not just in terms of secular significance, but even in terms of the religious significance for some of our Jewish friends who were really quite Orthodox. And I think that our viewers are going to be fascinated as these interviews progress and then as they access your DVD, God's Holy Days, to see just how significant they are. Are they relevant today for Christians from your perspective?
I mean, that's the question of the hour. Every time I travel, people say, well, if you're not Jewish yourself, Joe, then why do you come to us? We're not Jews. Why do we need to know about Passover? Are they relevant? Absolutely. Are they necessary for salvation? Absolutely not. But are they necessary to deepen our understanding of who Jesus was, what he did, and then what he's going to do at his second coming? Absolutely. You can't study the feasts without being impacted by how much Jesus almost went out of his way, it seems, to make sure he fulfilled all of the requirements. Whether you're studying the Passover lamb or you're going right to the end with the Feast of Tabernacles, and you look at all the parallels, they're not accidental. I really think that a lot of Christians have been turned off to the feasts because, it's been pushed in their face. You've got to do this, and you have to honor the Sabbath, and you have to do these things. And there's a wall that goes up because we say, hey, we're not Jewish. That doesn't apply to us. And so we don't teach practice. We teach people to look at them, learn from them. And then clearly Jesus emerges as the Messiah. But then also the cultural elements of the feast, they begin to rise. And we begin to see parallels. Simple things like in requirements for the lamb had to be firstborn, no lambs, the bones couldn't be broken, all of these things. And then you look at when the gospel writers are writing about Jesus, it's mirroring, the feast. So I definitely think there's relevance for Christians today.